All right, it's always hard to tell somebody to stop talking and to sit down. We love to share and to fellowship with one another. The hardest thing in the church that I used to serve at was just to get people to to stop talking, to get them to sit down. So it's always a great thing when we're willing to fellowship, when we're willing to say hello to each other and shake hands. And so I'll challenge you as you go through your day, meet somebody that you don't know, connect with them, get involved in some kind of community event with one another, and so that you can grow in our faith with God and with one another. So thank you so much for being here this morning. Like I said, my name is Jake Moore, and Pastor Rick asked me to bring a message this morning. And so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 6. And so if you want to turn there, this is kind of the start of the Noah story. Now, many of you have children in this room, or you will one day. And my wife and I, we have 2 kids. Levi is 5 years old, and Hadley is 3. And anytime that you experience little kids, you know what disobedience is, don't you? Have you ever experienced that? You know, when you tell them to do something and they just don't do it. Or if you tell them and then you tell them again and then you tell them again and they still refuse to do it. I think about my 2 kids, and just the other day we were experiencing a major aspect of disobedience in our home. And I remember telling my son to go to his room to pick up all the toys, because if he wanted to go to the UFO festival, he needed to get everything picked up. And so he started playing with some toys rather than picking them up, you know. And so I go to his room and he's still not picking them up, and I'm telling him, Levi, you have to pick up your toys if you want to go. He wanted to go to the rides. If you want to go to the rides, if you want to go to the festival, you've got to pick up all your toys. And so he started to pick up 1 or 2 things, and then he got a little preoccupied and didn't want to do it again. And so we experience in my house disobedience on a regular basis. And so what are some of the things that you can think of in your life in which you experience a direct disregard for obedience? Maybe it's with your children like we experience sometimes. Maybe it's a coworker or a family member or a friend. We often think of obedience, but we associate it with disobedience. Have you ever done that? You think about, what is obedience? Well, usually it's better to think about it on disobedience. We always turn a positive into a negative. If I think about my kids, I could probably count on my hand the few times that they've obeyed the very first time that I've told them. So usually we go to the disobedient side. Our 2015 Grace Vision here is transformed for the purposes of God. Pastor Rick said last week, and I just want to share with you again, that is what we're all about. It's just seeing people's lives transformed by the grace of God, by His power, to see difference in people's lives. And so we're going to continue our series today, our Wise Guys series, with Noah, a wise obedience. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 6. We find this start of Noah's story here. So the world was filled with a lot of disobedience to God. There was much sin. There was overpopulation. There was demonic activity. There was sexual perversion. There was a constant widespread evil in the heart of people. And so there was so much disobedience, God needed to start all over again. And He was going to start all over again with a guy named Noah. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6, He says that the Lord was grieved that He made man on earth, and His heart was filled with pain. And as I'm researching and I'm studying this out, I find out that word grieved. If you don't know what it means the same feeling, and it's used in other aspects of the Old Testament, but the same feeling that an abandoned spouse would feel. If your spouse just up and left you, that soul-wrenching, despairing grief. And that's what God felt. And He says that His heart was filled with pain. So there was a great need for obedience because there was so much disobedience. So Genesis chapter 6, starting with verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark will be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof and opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, and you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, every male and female, to keep them alive with you. Two of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to make every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and them. And the most important verse is this: Noah did everything just as God had commanded him. Noah did everything. So this concept of a wise obedience. In verse 8 it said that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And some translations say that Noah found grace in the eyes of God. He found grace. That word is unmerited favor, that he didn't earn it, but yet he found it. The greatest thing is that we cannot earn the grace of God, but yet we can find it because God freely gives it away. No one earns it, but we can find it. Noah didn't intend to be in this situation. I'm pretty sure that when Noah was born and as he was growing up, he did not think that the world would be destroyed and he would be the one to build a giant boat in the middle of the desert before it ever rained. I'm pretty sure that was probably not on Noah's mind, but yet he just did what was right. So Noah found favor in the eyes of God. And for that reason, it was counted to him as being a righteous man. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless among the people. Often we sacrifice what we know to be true and what we know to be right for something else. We'll throw away what we know is truth and give it to something that is maybe more pleasurable, something that just gets to us at that moment. And I was thinking it must have been hard, and it must have taken a lot of faith for Noah to build this boat in the middle of the desert with no rain. It had to have. Can you imagine the ridicule, the mocking that he would have been able to experience from people? I can only think about that. Imagine this. We leave church today, and Pastor Rick is in the middle of the field out here by the park building a boat. Many of you would be like, what are you thinking? This is crazy. Now, it's different now with as much rain as been experienced here in New Mexico. In North Carolina, this kind of rain where I'm from is normal. Here, I know it is a little abnormal. But if Rick was out in that field building that boat, we would all question his sanity, wouldn't we? So we don't always do that. We experience that with somebody like Rick, but we don't always see that with somebody like Noah. So let's look at a few points this morning to see what it can happen in our lives to help make us wise guys. Number one, Noah was a righteous man because he walked with God. See, Noah walked with him. He was found righteous. He was blameless only because he walked. He walked step by step in faith with God. He took his steps alongside God. We can see that he was counted as a righteous man because of this. All the other people were doing their own thing. The whole reason why God needed to start over. They were doing their own thing, what was important to them. But yet Noah walked with him. Noah cared about him. He walked step in step with faith as a living example to his generation. Do you know that we can do that today? That we can walk step by step in faith to God and be an example to our own generation? My son, my daughter, your children, the people that we experience every single day in our jobs or wherever it may be. We can walk step in step by faith, and they will see that, and it'll change their lives. Noah was counted as a righteous man. Didn't mean that he didn't sin or that he was perfect, but rather that he wholeheartedly loved God, that he wholeheartedly obeyed God. That was Noah. And so a lesson that we can learn from Noah is that obedience is based on our proximity to God. The closer that you are to God, the more likely it will be that you will obey him. If you walk step in step with God and the closer that you are to him, when he gives you something to do, you don't question it. You're like Noah. You do everything as God commanded. That's what happens when you walk in proximity to God. I think about my son, and I'm sharing a lot about them this morning, but because it's a great example of them. When I get home in the evening, the first thing that I see is my son's at the door. And the very first thing he says is, "You play with me, Daddy?" Usually that means I'm going to be wore out, I'm not going to get to eat anything, and I'm definitely not sitting down. And so when I come in and he says, "Would you play with me, Daddy?" It doesn't matter if I have to go to the bathroom or if I need to go change my clothes. He follows right behind me, almost to the point that he's going to step on me. Almost that if I stop, he's going to run into the back of me and fall down. That's how close he is. But as I think about that, he tries to imitate me. And he tries to be just like me. The more that we are imitators of Christ, we will be closer to God, be more likely to obey him. So do we ever think about what our obedience to God really is? Have you ever, like at the end of the day, ever said, "Hey God, I did everything that you asked of me today"? Have you ever thought of that? Usually that's not a question we ask at the end of the day. But when we do ask that question, who is the judge of it? Maybe you can't really relate to that, but let me take you back. Imagine you're back in school. Some of you are in school, but you're back in school, and at the end of the day, the teacher has given you all the work that they've required of you. And at the end of the day, you say to the teacher, "I did everything that you asked of me today." Well, we know that you are not the judge of that. That the teacher is the judge of whether you did what you were supposed to do or not. Because if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, you're probably not going to get a very good grade. And so the teacher is the judge of that. Well, that does not change in the concept of God. God is the judge of our obedience. And so we often give him short-term obedience, but what about long-term obedience to God? See, God deserves our gratitude. He deserves our thankfulness. He doesn't deserve our grumbling. And so we are wise guys when we truly obey. So Noah was a righteous man because he walked with God. Number two, step one in obedience is our priorities. 1 John chapter 5, verse 1 through 3 says this: "Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands, and his commands are not burdensome." See, our obedience to God just proves our love for him. And so what does God command us to do? Well, it can be summed up like this: to love God and to love people. We love God with everything that we have, and we love people as ourselves. If we would begin to do that, lives would be changed. So what's most important to us? What do we love? Well, your bank account usually proves what you love, isn't it? Where you spend your money or where you spend your time, that proves what you love. What is most important to you? Well, it's about our priorities. It's about what's important to us. And so the greatest lesson that I learned in my life was a lesson from a man that was a friend, a mentor of mine. And what he told me was so life-changing to me was that, Jake, you have to have your priorities right. First must be God. You love him with everything. Second must be your wife. You love her. And third is your children. And then everything else. And that began to change my life, because if your marriage is messed up, if God is first, it tends to fix your marriage. If your children are messed up, if you really love your spouse, it starts to fix your children as well. So the greatest lesson in my life about priorities was that God was first, my wife is second, my children is third, and then everything else is under that. So obedience also gives us hope in the midst of uncertainty. Noah didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but can you imagine being shut up in a giant boat like Noah was, with all of those animals? Can you imagine the smell? I'm not really an animal guy, but I can only imagine the smell. And on top of that, being shut up in that big boat with his family. I don't know about you, but if I'm in a big boat like that for a long time with my family, that's torture. Especially my extended family. You know, you don't want to be in there with in-laws and things like that too long. And so that would be torture for them. But Noah wasn't a young man. He just built this boat out of faith that God told him what to do, and he obeyed. He didn't know the outcome. You don't have to know the outcome. But when you know your priorities and when you put your priorities in the right line, there's hope. Now, I can think of another group of people who had a problem in the midst of uncertainty, and that was in Luke chapter 8. And the disciples, as they're in this boat, and the great storm came, and the waves began to crash, and Jesus is asleep in the boat. And their response is they run to him and wake him, and they say to him, don't you care that we're going to die? Don't you care that we're perishing? Well, Jesus wakes up, calms the sea, calms the storm, and he says to them, where is your faith? Where is it that your faith is at? Because they thought they had it in him, but when the storm came, they were really uncertain. So the question is where is your faith? So when things are uncertain in your life, where is your faith? Well, when your priorities are right, you begin to obey God, and things begin to get into line. You know where your faith is. Noah also had to dramatically change, it had to have dramatically changed the outlook of Noah's life. This faith, this obedience that Noah had as he is building the boat and doing what he's called to do, it had to have been a hard thing for him. But it had to change his outward experience of the priorities in light of God's grace to him, how good God was. Because guess what? God was going to start all over with Noah. He was going to wipe the world out, start all over again with Noah. After this experience, Noah couldn't go on living as usual. He couldn't do the same thing. It had to have been an internal change in Noah's life. It had to have been a radical change. Think about this. Noah knew what was going to happen, but everybody else didn't. And so every single person that he saw after that moment that God spoke to him, he knew that they were headed for destruction. The home that he had built, he knew would soon be gone. Everything that he had worked for, materialistically, would be gone. He knew that, so it changed his perspectives in light of God's priorities for him. And so that's in Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis chapter 7, the floodwaters come, they rise, and they're in the boat. And then all of a sudden here in Genesis chapter 7, verse 5, it says, and Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Again, he just did what God told him to do. So we are wise guys when we have the right priorities. So Noah was a righteous man because he walked with God. And step one in obedience is about our priorities. And then obedience is about the steps that we take. Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, it says this. This is after the waters have subsided and Noah can go out of the boat. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. So in order to get from one place to the next, we have to take a step. We have to begin to take a step. You know, if you never start a step, your first step, you're never going to get anywhere. You never can. And that's what obedience is taking our first step. So if we don't take the first step, we'll never get anywhere. And Noah did what he was told when he was told. You see that delayed obedience is still disobedience. Often we have this, I'll do it tomorrow kind of attitude. You know, I will do what you tell me to tomorrow, God, because right now it's more pleasing to what I like. And so when we moved to New Mexico, and we got to our home, there was a lot of weeds in the front little flower area of our home. I worked really, really hard on that. I cleared it all out, and I got it all down, and I sprayed weed killer. I got it all taken care of. Put some really nice red mulch out. It looked good. One day I was walking in after I left the church. I got home. As I walked in, I saw one piece of grass sticking up in the middle of the mulch. And I was really tired that day, so I said, I'll take care of it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow never happened. Tomorrow never happened. The next day never happened. And so just the other day, I'm walking in and I look at, there's grass everywhere through my nice, pretty red mulch. And I thought, why did I delay on taking care of that one piece of grass? I could have fixed this problem a long time ago. And see, we just do that in our lives. We delay the obedience we have towards God. We put it off a little bit. Sin begins to take over our life. Things get a little out of control, and then all of a sudden we're left with a big weed problem. That's what happens when we're disobedient to God. But because he didn't delay, Noah had a faith that worked. It became physical. He didn't just believe in God, he did something about it. Hebrews chapter 11, the great chapter of faith, Noah is listed there in verse 7, Hebrews 11 verse 7 says this, by faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness that comes from faith. See, Noah didn't have to see the entire picture to know that God had the best thing in mind for him. He didn't have to see everything. But the last step that Noah made was that he built an altar. So what he did was he worshiped God. God destroyed everything, but yet he worshiped him. He was grateful for what God did, and he offered sacrifices. So what characterizes Noah and God's interaction is that God commands, Noah does. What should characterize our interaction with God? God commands, we do. So how do we really grow in our obedience to God? I've got 3 things for you I hope you take away for today. How do we really grow in our obedience to God? Number 1 is that we listen. Often we pray, we petition, we beg, we ask God for so much. But very rarely do we take a moment to just reflect and listen to what he's telling us. So we can begin to grow in our obedience to God if we would just start to listen to him. Also, number 2, is if we would repeat. See, here's the thing that we often miss about when God shares something and lays it on our heart, is that we should repeat it to others. We should tell somebody about it because it will help us be accountable to it. Think about it. If you never told anybody something that God told you and you didn't do it, who would know? No person, only God. But if you repeat it to somebody, you begin a level of accountability in that. You also repeat it back to God. And number 3, that we act. So we grow in our obedience to God is that we begin to act on what he tells us to do. We act on what he commands from us. So we are wise guys when we begin to take steps toward God. 2 John verse 6. I love this verse. It says this, and this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love. See, Noah was a wise guy because he loved God enough to obey him. We love him enough to obey him. See, love only wins when it's first pointed at God. It doesn't win in any other area of this world unless it is first pointed to God. His obedience didn't stop at whatever he thought he should be doing. He put his own opinions aside. He put his own thoughts aside. But he did exactly what God had told him to do. Have you ever seen a teenager who is in love? It's a sickening thing, isn't it? If you're a teenager and you're in love in here, I'm sorry, but it's sickening to watch you. But you know what's important about a teenager that's in love? They do not care who sees them. They do not care if somebody sees them holding hands or hugging or kissing or whatever they do. They don't care. They also don't care what people think about them being in love. I was thinking about that and I thought, wow, it's sick to think of a teenager in love and how mushy that is. But that's how we should be towards God. That we should love God so much that we don't care what people think about our love towards God. We don't care about who sees us love God, who sees us worship God. We are so in love with God that we begin to obey him. Well, my guess is that God will give us all opportunities this week to make a decision, to obey or not to obey. It could be obedience about our quiet time. See, many of you in this room, if I was to ask, you'd probably raise your hand and say, I have a hard time getting up in the morning. And I was thinking about that. I'm a morning person. I have an easy time getting up. But people, they hit their snooze button like 10, 12 times. One person who does that I know is my wife's mom. She'll hit it like 10 or 12 times every day. Well, one day whenever I was on my way, I had to go back home a month or so ago before my mom passed away. And I traveled back and I got delayed in Dallas. I got late into Charlotte, North Carolina, and I couldn't get a rental car. So I spent the night in the airport. Have you ever experienced that? That's not fun. So I spent the night in the airport. I finally got a rental car early the next morning, about 5 o'clock. I drove to my wife's mom's house, and it's dark. It's about 5 o'clock. I pull up, and the car is just right in the driveway, right beside the bedroom window. And this is a new car. It's not my car. And the keys are in my pocket. And I'm trying to dig my keys out of my pocket. I was talking on the phone to a friend. And the next thing I know, the horn blew. The lights is going off. The panic button. And right in their window. Well, immediately their lights flipped on. You could see that happen. And I knew that she was awake then. I say that to tell you, if you need me to come to your house and blow my horn and flash my lights in the window to get you up for you to be obedient to God, just let me know. I'll send Lyndall. But really, that's what obedience is about. It could be obedience to begin faithful service, faithful giving. Maybe it's about giving of your finances, or maybe it's about giving of your time. Begin to be obedient about that, to start serving in a ministry. Here's one of the greatest ways you can do that. We are planning and praying through the start of a third service, planting a third service in the fall. We still need people who are willing and committed to invite, to serve, and to attend that service. Maybe you're kind of on the fence about what that is. Make sure that you find somebody, and maybe it's time that you start serving and being obedient to what God may have for you. Maybe it's that service, or maybe it's in here, or being a greeter, or no matter what it is. Begin to be obedient to God through your gifts. And it could be obedience to share your story about how much God changed your life. Sometimes we miss that part of life. But God has given us all opportunities almost every day to share our story with somebody. And often we don't do it. My greatest failure is at the pharmacy line, usually at Walmart. You ever went to the pharmacy line at Walmart? I've not been here in Roswell, but in Fayetteville, North Carolina, there's like 50 people in line. Every time I would stand in that line the entire time. And whenever I would get done, I'd get my prescription, I would leave, and I felt real good. But I had so many opportunities to tell somebody my story about how God changed my life and was not obedient to God. He put me in those places every single week. So we could do that. So Noah found favor with God, and you can too. You just got to put your trust, put your faith in Jesus. And so as Noah was a man who was obedient, did what God commanded him to do, we have to step up and begin to use the things that God gives us to show that faith in him. Do something about it. Be obedient to God. Maybe your obedience is that you have never put your faith and your trust in Jesus. Take the first step. Show God how much you love him. Give your life to Christ. Maybe it's the service. No matter what it is, we love God, we love people, and our obedience will grow. Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you for the privilege that we have to be in this place today, to gather with so many people who love you, who care. God, I pray that as we begin to think about what obedience really is and what that looks like, would you show us? Thank you for giving us a great example of a man named Noah who walked with you, who had his priorities right, and God, who took the step and made faith physical. Lord, I pray that we would do that here today. Maybe it's just somebody who needs to put their trust and faith in you. Maybe it's somebody who needs to commit to go into our Class 101 and joining our church and becoming a part of our family here. Maybe it's somebody who needs to get involved in a ministry, begin to serve, or to give of their finances, to give of their time. Lord, I pray that they would put a priority on you. But you are most important in our life. We just thank you that you give us love, that you give us a Jesus to die on a cross for our sins. We're just so thankful for that. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.